Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Kolakowski, and joining me today is an esteemed panel of smart people that I am excited to be with. I'm going to kind of do the Hollywood squares on my screen. I'm going to start with Ryan Quint in my upper left. Ryan, the world's leading expert in the Battle of Drainsville. If you haven't checked out his book, do so. Ryan, how are you today?
Doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Delighted to
How
have
are
you
you?
as well. Angie Zombeck comes to us from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. And Angie, I bet you're excited because usually, as someone whose last name starts with Z, you probably get introduced last, right?
Yes,
So,
I've kind of owned that.
so glad to have you back with us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And of course, coming from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, my great Polish brother, Chris Kolakowski, a former ECW chief historian. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Really doing real well, doing real well. And thank you all for joining me today. As we're shifting now into 2025, if you're following the 160th anniversary of the Civil War, that puts us into 1865. It's the year the war wraps up. But at this time, people don't know it's the year that the war is going to wrap up. And so lots of big stuff, lots of things going on, huge monumental things in terms of U.S. history. And so I wanted to get some of my friends and colleagues together to talk about the year and its importance. So let's for a second pretend that it's January 1865. We don't know that this is the last year of the war. We might know it's winding down. And Chris, I'll start with you. What are people's mindsets heading into 1865?
But it depends on where you're standing. If the Confederacy, they're grasping at whatever straws they can to hang on as long as they can still. I mean, you look at the defiant rhetoric, some of the debates that start to happen in the Confederate Congress, including about arming the slaves to continue resistance. I mean, so the Confederacy knows that they're running out of chips. They're running out of options. The Northern armies, of course, are moving all over. Sherman, the March to the Sea has just happened. He's taken Savannah. He's starting to move into the Carolinas campaign. So the Confederacy is bleeding. The question is, how mortal are the wounds, at least in the Confederate government's mind? At the same time, you get the Hampton Roads Conference in February of 1865, a bid for peace, a bid for some sort of negotiated settlement to the war. So you get a sense that the Confederate government is looking for a way to exit the war. And if they can't exit the war, they're going to try and prolong it as long as they can for the North to give up. On the Northern side, Lincoln has been reelected. They're looking forward to the inauguration. What does that mean? But the Confederacy remains undefeated. And one of the more interesting passages in Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs is he talked about how Northern war weariness may have reared its head again had the war gone on much longer than it ultimately did. So the North is, riding a nice tide of success with victories in the Valley, of course, the reelection of Lincoln, the naval victories, things like that, and of course the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864. But at the same time, there's that there's still that kind of foundation of sand, if you will, particularly that somebody like Grant, who's a very perceptive observer, is picking up on. So there is no guarantee on either side that this is going to go the way it goes or go as quickly as it does. That's for sure.
So, Angie, what are you thinking?
I can add to that, maybe taking a political stance. So the election of 1864, one of the things that came out of the platform, and particularly from the radicals in the Republican Party, is wanting to do something to solidify emancipation, because the Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order. And depending on how the war goes, what happens in the next election a few years down the road, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding whether that status of freedom will be permanent. So there's a push in January of 1865 to get the 13th Amendment through Congress, which it will do by the end of that month. So that's one political dynamic that I think is really important. The other is, I mean, like Chris said, Union victory is not a foregone conclusion, but there's also been kind of a debate again between Lincoln and especially the radical Republicans about the status of the South. So from Lincoln's perspective, he's a little bit more moderate on that question and perceives that the Southern states are still a part of the Union. And again, the radicals in Congress are thinking that, basically secession is political suicide. And so when the war ends, should it end in favor of the Union, then what do we do about readmitting the states? And radicals would much prefer to have Congress take control of that and treat the Confederate states as territories. So there's that underlying political dynamic that's running through all of the military campaigns. And I think adding to some uncertainty as well, Lincoln has pretty much staked out in December of 1863 with his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction that he wants a reunion to be amicable. But there were a lot of folks who really took issue with that.
Before I ask Ryan to join in, I suppose I should have you introduce your cat.
Yes.
We're seeing the cat there, and
I was hoping that he would
that's
calm
right.
down.
Yeah.
But this is Sherman, and he is living up to his namesake.
He's gearing up to head to Bentonville since it's 1865, right? And Ryan's thinking like, now I got to follow the cat, really?
He's a tough act to follow.
Ryan, your thoughts at the dawn of 1865?
Yeah, a lot of dittos, right? A lot of the big points have already been said. So if we zoom into the trenches around Petersburg, for example, you still have the diehard Confederates we can still win this. You are starting to see more and more deserters flocking to the Union lines. You're going to have some battles in February, the Battle of Hatcher's Run. So Robert E. Lee is still holding on, and George Gordon Meade is still trying to crack that position with Grant over his shoulders. But yeah, the political situation's already been covered pretty well. So I'll just say that yeah, the spring is coming, and both sides realize that the fighting is going to resume again, and what that looks like is anybody's guess.
So Ryan, let me have you back us up a little bit because, we've talked about that political situation. It seems like the election of 64 is kind of that point of no return because Lincoln gets reelected and now we're going to see this through. But then John Bell Hood has his Tennessee campaign through Franklin and Nashville. And so the Confederacy is still trying at that point. That sense like it's not over. We don't know what we're going to achieve, but it's not over yet. Walk me through kind of what that mindset must be like, because there's a lot of contradiction inherent in that.
Yeah, I don't think anything is inevitable in history. The actions take people to make those decisions and actions. So I think the Franklin-Nashville campaign, culminating in the Battle of Nashville in December of 64, is a good example of that, right? Even as John Bell Hood is smashing into the Union lines in Franklin, or getting hit by George Thomas at Nashville, it's showing the dedication to the cause. This belief that, we may have lost the battles of Gettysburg or Vicksburg a year earlier, it's not really making a difference to the diehards in the Army who are saying we can still win this thing. But with the inauguration of Lincoln, right, in March, I'm ahead just a little bit, there is, I think, a dawning realization that this is getting harder and harder and harder, and leading others to take some more drastic measures, right? Like, we know that the conspirators who are going to target Lincoln go from, we're going to kidnap him for ransom to, we're going to assassinate him, right? So the diehards are getting even more diehard. They're looking for drastic decisions to change the game, even as the game is getting towards its conclusion.
Angie, you've done a lot of work on incarceration. And since Ryan talked about the men in the trenches, we also have a lot of men who are in Civil War prisons at this point, as we're now in the depths of winter. 65 is dawning. What's it like for those guys who are essentially in limbo at this dawn of the new year?
They're pretty desperate because they don't see any hope of an exchange cartel being resumed to the extent that it was when the Dix Hill cartel was in operation between the summer of 62 and the summer of 1863. In 1864, there was actually a contingency of prisoners sent from Andersonville to kind of give Lincoln more of a heads up of what was going on specifically at that place, but there was still no real hope of exchange. And speaking of Andersonville, the Confederate authorities start to evacuate it as Sherman is moving down through his Atlanta campaign, especially once he gets Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864. They're afraid that he might strike for Andersonville to liberate those prisoners. And so they start moving them into places like Millen, Georgia, and Florence, South Carolina. So, and that's really first and foremost the prisoners who were well enough to be evacuated. So there was a small number left. So it's a lot of uncertainty. It's a lot of moving around. It's a lot of really, I mean, obviously pining for home and pining for the war to end. So there's that aspect of it. But still, even the prisoners, many of them thought that the war had to end in favor of the Union, despite whatever trials they might be facing. And so a lot of them in their diaries, especially sometimes in their letters home, see that the sacrifice that they're making in prison is akin to the sacrifice that the soldiers are still making on the battlefield.
And I've got to think too, just, you mentioned Andersonville, and up north, people like to point at Elmira. It was a cold January in Elmira, New
Yes.
York at this particular
Yes.
point. So those guys are especially miserable in its own freezing sort of way.
Yes.
And I sort of laugh about it, but it's, it's awful, but like, wow, it's, we forget, like, as we're, today talking about these big sweeping things on a very human level, there's just still a lot of misery and discomfort and uncertainty going on.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Elmira and also Johnson's Island, and I can raise that to talk about kind of the segregation, if you will, among prisoners, because that was a prison that was primarily for Confederate officers. And a lot of those men were really trying to use whatever political connections that they had to get paroled, get out in one way or another. And then as it turns out, when prisoners were released, it went from the bottom up. So the enlisted men were allowed to go home once the war was over first. And the higher ups in the Confederate Army were actually kept for longer.
And Chris, if I'm an enslaved person at the dawn of 1865 in an area that's still held in rebellion, that the federal armies haven't yet reached, or maybe I'm in an area where the Sherman has marched through and left, what does the situation look like for that population?
I think the answer depends on where you stand. There are people to point out and to kind of talk about it. There are still large parts of the Confederacy that have not seen the tramp of Union boots yet. Significant parts, particularly the interior of Alabama, to say nothing of the Trans-Mississippi further west. Sherman, at this point, if we're talking January of 1865, is just crossing into South Carolina. So there are still large swaths of the Confederacy that the Union Army still has to get into. Of course, they will throughout the 1865 campaigns, the Mobile campaign, of course, Carolinas, Virginia, all these places. So if you're in these areas and you're further from the front lines, in a lot of ways, it's similar to what will happen in Texas in the summer of 1865 with the proclamation of Juneteenth. You're waiting for the Union Army to draw near, which is just like what the enslaved people of Georgia did when they were waiting for Sherman to show up, and then they followed him. And they'll do that. You'll see that scene replaced again in the Carolinas, and then reenacted to a certain extent during the Grand Review. So you're waiting on that. If you've been through and if Sherman has passed through and you chose not to follow, to the other part of your question, things can get really uncertain and really hairy because Georgia militia and bushwhackers find their way and fill in behind the wake that Sherman's army has left. You look particularly at a town like Milledgeville or Macon or things like that where they pass through, or even Griswoldville, where some of my ancestors fought Georgia militia. Once the Union Army moved on, Confederate authority tried to reassert itself, which also meant, violence, enslavement. It meant all kinds of things. It was the backwash of the war, if you will. So really the Union Army, if you're an enslaved person, the Union Army is your best hope and really only hope for freedom, is to get to Union lines and stay close to Union units. As evidenced in 64 with Sherman.
Which causes huge logistical issues for the armies that suddenly have all these mouths to feed and people to employ and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Too. Absolutely right.
So I want to just toss a big question out there and then we'll kind of unpack it as we go here for a little bit. So what is the most important thing that happens in 1865? And it's a year of big things, but as we said in January, we don't know they're going to happen. 160 years later, we do. What's the biggest thing that happens in 1865? Ryan, can I start with you?
Yeah, I'm gonna toss out one. I hinted at it earlier, but I think it's the assassination of Lincoln. Um, it throws so much into question. What happens next? Does this go deeper than 10 or so conspirators? Is the Confederate government involved? Are they going to hit elsewhere? So all of the plans, Lincoln tells Grant before Appomattox to let him up easy. That's all of a sudden in question because what's Andrew Johnson going to do, right? If we're still going with our we don't know yet, right? And so yeah, what does all of that leave? It's a huge open book. So I'll say the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, very good. I'll give everyone the chance to answer the question, then we'll go back and sort of look at everybody's answers a little bit more in depth. So, Angie, what's your big event?
I would say, and it's kind of piggybacking off of Ryan, and it goes back to 1864, but it is Andrew Johnson is the most important thing that happens in 1865. He being the only Southern senator that doesn't resign his seat, and Lincoln putting him on the ticket in 1864 as, again, kind of an olive branch to the South. And Johnson is a relatively simple yet very complicated figure, I think, because he's got, given his upbringing and styling himself as kind of the champion of the yeoman, he's got a distinct hatred for the Southern planters. And so I think for a moment, there's kind of a glimmer of hope among radical Republicans that, maybe he's going to come down hard on the South in the way that they would like. But in reality, he is also sympathetic to white Southerners and their constitutional rights and the right to own property. And he doesn't have anywhere in his agenda any provisions for protecting civil rights of newly freed slaves. And I mean, really, to be fair, if we look at the period historically, very few people did have that. So I think that's a point that's worth mentioning. But Andrew Johnson, I think, is one of the most important things that happens, and also the fact that Congress is out of session for much of 1865 until December.
Yeah. I can't help but think someplace Andrew Johnson is happy that someone has named him the most important thing of 1860. Who'd have had that on their bingo card? Huh?
I can't argue with that.
My great Polish brother.
As you know me, Chris, I tend to look at things with a very broad perspective. And I'm gonna start one place and I'm gonna end up basically in agreement with my other two panelists. 1865 is one of those watershed years in American history. The nation may have been founded in 1776. It was the Constitution in 1787 codified it. It was refounded in 1865. And if you look at the several events that Lincoln sets in motion before his death, the 13th Amendment, the manifesto that he has for the Union, for the reconstruction of the Union that he lays out in his second inaugural, which, quite frankly, in many ways, those ideas energized the assassination attempt against him. And then also the let him up easy, which Ryan mentioned earlier as well. Those last two in particular, go against most of world history. Mm-hmm. Just in the first half of the 19th century, if you look at the Polish rebellions against Russia, if you look at Napoleon, the losing side of the Napoleon after the defeat of Napoleon, all these different cases where you have similar situations, this goes against world history just in the last 60 years before 1865, to say nothing of the previous centuries. So that should be borne in mind. All of that said, it's a tremendous opportunity, and in many ways, what is done we still are working through that legacy today. all of that is to a certain extent hampered, if not in some cases short-circuited, by the assassination of Lincoln. Had Lincoln lived with the prestige of having just won the war and been the chief executive that led the saving of the Union, you look at how Reconstruction developed and the debates and a lot of what Angie talked about, his presence and that prestige, not to mention his skills, which are obviously he was a much more deft politician than Andy Johnson. Also, he was sober at his inauguration, but that's neither here nor there. But nonetheless, you think about all the issues that this nation had to confront in the rest of that presidential term before 1869. Imagine if Lincoln had been there. It's one of the great missed opportunities in the United States in our history, and we are still dealing with the consequences thereof today.
One of the things I've always wondered about that, because, you know, Lincoln does successfully hold together his political coalition for 4 years and into the reelection. And it's easy for us to think like, okay, well, he's going to keep on doing what he's doing. But the tenor of the country would be so different afterwards. Could he have held that coalition together? Could those skills of his been enough? Does he die at his Jimi Hendrix moment, where he's at the peak of his powers and doesn't have the opportunity to fail? You know, and so to me, that's such a fascinating moment because it is so ripe with potential and possibility, potential failure. You know, and will it? Obviously unknowable. We'll never know, but it really, I think, is a great moment to look at and peel back because it tells us so much about the different players and what we do know and can understand them better. Angie, let me ask you to kind of back up, since Ryan and Chris have both talked about Lincoln's assassination and its implications. You sort of talk about the aftermath of that with Andy Johnson, but tell me your thoughts about Lincoln and you know the shift that happens.
Well, I think he, throughout the war, is trying to strike a really conciliatory tone. And his primary interest is to, I mean, everybody's heard this before, but his primary interest is to save the Union and get on with reconciliation. He's had a lot of conflict. For example, I mentioned before the 1863 Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. We can see that he has a coalition, he has a strong cabinet, but he also has pretty significant disagreements with the radical Republicans who came out right away and in the Wade Davis bill, after that proclamation was issued in 1863, basically outlined their differences, that they wanted to take a harder stance on the South. So I'm not sure. I mean, certainly there's an outpouring of grief, and even some Southerners, when Lincoln is assassinated, thought, this is terrible. I mean, who knows how things are going to go now? We kind of had an idea with him, but I think there's still kind of, maybe not to the extent that it turned out to be with Andrew Johnson, as far as animosity. There's still disagreements in, as far as how Lincoln saw the process of Reconstruction going versus how some of the radical Republicans in Congress saw that process going, because there's a group of moderates that was kind of more with Lincoln, and it took a lot for them to actually join with the radicals. So I mean, Lincoln is, it's one of those hypotheticals that and students want to know, like, what would have happened if, you know, if he hadn't been assassinated? What would have happened if he had lived? And I almost wonder if we wouldn't be having some of the same debates, maybe in a different way, that came about, that occurred because of Andrew Johnson's presidency.
It's interesting because, you know, Lincoln never really formally articulates what his vision for Reconstruction is, you know, and he has conferences with Sherman and Sheridan and Porter, and, you know, he has conversations, but he never lays anything out in a public way, which then, you know, because of his assassination, there's no template for people to follow. Do you guys think Grant would have run for president if not for Andrew Johnson? Like, is Grant feeling compelled as one of the people who does know Lincoln's vision to step forward for the presidency eventually? Because otherwise, who's going to carry on that torch? Ryan, what do you think about that?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Yeah, I think there's certainly a call and response, right? I mean, by the time that Grant is elected, things are good. Not 1868, 1869, things are going all kinds of haywire in the South, right? With the emergence of paramilitary groups, the emergence of essentially a counterinsurgency. I think Grant, yeah, is almost called to bat, and he has to step in, um, because people, Andrew Johnson's not doing enough, right? And Andrew Johnson barely avoids being removed from office. Grant is at the center of all of that, right? Stanton and Grant and all of that. So yeah, I think Grant is certainly stepping in to kind of fill a void that he doesn't think enough is being done to support the rights of the formerly enslaved who are now being targeted by these paramilitary organizations.
Yeah. Chris, any thoughts?
I think Ryan's on to something. I would also suggest that it's in response as well to who the Democratic nominee is that year, Horatio Seymour. This is somebody who was very anti-Lincoln during the war. He was the governor who went and greeted the New York City draft rioters with arms outstretched and yelled, "My friends." So that gives you some idea of who Horatio Seymour is. And by 1869, obviously those positions have hardened. So it's not just a call and response to Andrew Johnson, it's a call and response to to the opponent as well. So there's a lot of different factors that propel Grant to kind of assume the mantle of what's left of the Lincoln mantle to carry it forward.
Yeah. Anything you'd want to add, Angie?
I agree with all of that. I also think it's Grant feels that his leadership is necessary given what's going on in the South, because between 1865 and 1868, there's the process of radical Reconstruction and Southern states forming governments under the dictates that were outlined by the Republicans in Congress after they united and formed a coalition. And the backlash against that is the Ku Klux Klan. So I think Grant wants to make sure, in light of what my colleagues have said, that the rights of free people are protected. And he will end up doing that with the enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871. That's a little bit jumping, beyond the election, but he's certainly aware of the things that are going on in the South. And, Reconstruction is underway, but it's not necessarily going to be firm. So I think he wants to solidify that.
And I would add as well, the West is heating up.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the last of the Great Indian Wars starts really in 1862. After the Confederacy surrenders, you start getting Western expansion. Of course, Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869. And Grant sees this coming. You get a sense of his thinking about the development of the United States in the last section of his memoirs, where he talks about the United States becoming a continental power and how the Civil War and the decade immediately after has made a nation of great power and intelligence. He sees this coming. And he's always thought in these terms. Jack Davis' scholarship on Grant, looking at how Grant's childhood influences how he views America, I think is right on with this. And Grant realized Horatio Seymour is not the person to build to really manage and build the country in the direction it's going. And so Grant realizes, I have to do this. And as commanding general of the Army, which he is until he becomes president, he's been sitting at the vortex of this, of all of these factors, because the U.S. Army is involved in all of this. And so he realizes, and so you put it all together, you put all that together, and he feels the obligation, and I think correctly so, becomes the president.
So let's, we've been sort of talking about the implications of Lincoln's assassination. The other side of that coin was Angie's assertion that Andrew Johnson's the most important thing. Ryan, let me have you kind of chime in, talk about your perspectives of Johnson and why that becomes so important.
I think, Chris Kolakowski's already mentioned it. The dude who gets drunk at his own inauguration is not going to be the dude you necessarily want in charge when everything goes haywire. My own bias is I don't think particularly much of Andrew Johnson. So yeah, wrong guy at the helm. Kind of like a Murphy's Law, perfect storm. Wrong guy, wrong place, wrong time. Lincoln's attempt to present a unified ticket, right, explodes, right, and now you have this guy who is not really qualified, in my opinion, to be in charge of the nation coming out of the Civil War.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think he's the greatest argument against ticket balancing you could possibly have, right? Because there's absolutely no continuity between chief executives when you go from Lincoln to Johnson. So, my Polish brother, your thoughts about Andy Johnson?
I, I have a low opinion of Andrew Johnson. However, I do temper it a little bit. And I understand. I want to know why. I assume these people are not making dumb choices. So why do they make the choice that they make? He's the only senator from a southern state to stay loyal. That defiance and contrariness is a benefit during the war, particularly when you look at navigating Tennessee Unionist politics and then become really Reconstruction starts in Tennessee in 1864 under Andy Johnson's aegis, among others. He's not the only architect, don't get me wrong. But that defiance, which works during the Civil War, and that kind of narrow focus on, what needs to be done in pursuing certain objectives, damn the torpedoes. When you put it in a post-war situation after an assassination of Lincoln, is probably not the skill set that is necessary. And frankly, I think he was a little overwhelmed. I think he was out of his depth. And let's put it this way: in 1944, they knew they were picking a president when they threw Wallace off the ticket and put Harry Truman on as vice president, because they knew that FDR was not going to survive his next term, and so they needed somebody to take over and have that continuity. Andrew Johnson, nobody was thinking that when they threw Hamlin off the ticket. And by the way, Andy Johnson was of the other party.
Yep.
People forget that. And it's one of the very few times where this has happened in American history. And so it's not just balancing it regionally, but it's balancing it politically. And that, I think, adds to the discontinuity after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
I always wonder too if Hannibal Hamlin had stayed on the ticket, not been replaced by Johnson as a radical Republican. And I've just mentioned Hannibal Hamlin, who is from Bangor, Maine, and Ryan got all excited because he's from Maine too. Hamlin, being a radical Republican, would have gotten along better with what's going on in Capitol Hill. So maybe he wouldn't have had that acrimony, that animosity, that vengefulness that sort of erupts out of the whole Andy Johnson thing, which
What about Rosecrans?
poisons everything.
If the telegram to Rosecrans hadn't been sabotaged, we might have had our first. John Kennedy wouldn't have been our first Catholic president.
Yeah,
it would have been William Stark Rosecrans.
Yeah.
Who was also a frothy, defiant, aggressive personality. So that could have been, we might have amounted to the same thing.
So let me toss out a couple other potential big things from 1865 and get your thoughts on them. Let me start with the 13th Amendment. Passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. Pretty big deal. That doesn't happen. Potentially, slavery would exist in some form. Angie, what are your thoughts about the importance of the 13th Amendment?
I think the biggest thing that often doesn't get discussed when we talk about the 13th Amendment is that it abolishes slavery except as punishment for crime.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge, huge exception. And the rationale for it, Eric Foner talks about it very succinctly in Second Founding, but basically, and I don't want to call it a system, but prison labor was a thing everywhere. In the North, prison industries were thriving, whether they were done by machinery within prison walls or whether they were contracted out. So there's this recognition that if you abolish slavery and involuntary servitude across the board, then that prison labor system is illegal. And of course, there's going to be, a workers' movement as strong as it can be in the late 19th century in the North. It's going to push against that. But the reason I raise that and it being so significant is because eventually we go through iterations of legal changes in the South. So we get the Black Codes first during the time when Andrew Johnson is running presidential Reconstruction. The Grant administration, as we have said, kind of came back and cracked down on that. But once Reconstruction ends, and not only do we have Jim Crow laws passed, but also Southern states and localities revising their legal codes and turning petty crimes into felonies that they can then use to feed what becomes the convict leasing system. I think that's such a huge, huge point of significance, and it's something that just gets brushed under the rug. So the 13th Amendment, I think, is absolutely significant because of that. I mean, it's significant in other ways too, because, you know, it opens opportunities for formerly enslaved people, and they take advantage of that, build communities, build churches, get involved in politics. So there's a lot of success that comes out of that, but there's also this pushback by the time that Reconstruction is ending, whenever you want to date that too, if it's the conventional period, or, you know, it's longer or shorter, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Ryan, your thoughts on the 13th Amendment?
Yeah, while Andrew was talking, I was thinking that it's a perfect example of how a lot of history is yes, but ... Angie said that prison labor was a thing. Prison labor is a thing. If we look at a good example right now, right, the massive fires in California that are raging in January 2025, a large portion of the firefighters fighting those fires are made up of prisoners from California's prisons. So we're talking 160 years removed, 160 years removed from the passage of the 13th Amendment, but we're still dealing with the clause of except as a punishment for a crime, right? That's still with us.
Yeah. Kolakowski?
While also acknowledging that it's a huge deal to pass the 13th Amendment, right? Thomas Jefferson said that slavery was like holding a wolf by two ears. 13th Amendment nullifies a lot of that wolf, right? Problem that's been the problem since the Constitutional Convention. But yeah, the big clause of except as a punishment of a crime, still a big deal.
Yeah. Chris?
The last thing I'll simply mention is those are all interesting points. I hadn't really considered the exception piece, but I think there's something to that, and the ramifications. Again, it goes back to the refounding and the restructuring of the country. The 13th Amendment, and then of course the 14th and 15th, which come immediately after. That's the refounding of the Union I was talking about earlier. I do want to mention real quick that the 13th Amendment was absolutely necessary, because the Emancipation Proclamation, let's not forget, did not free all slaves. It was only in territories in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. And if you actually read the text, there are specific counties that are carved out where Union fronts are. And by the way, if you look in Kentucky newspapers, because the slave states that remained loyal, slavery was still practiced. In fact, as late as November and early December of 1865, you can find slave auction ads in Kentucky newspapers. It's not until, and there was actually a real problem when you get escaped slaves from the South that would start to go north for whatever reason. They'd get to Kentucky, and this is 1864, thinking they're free. Slavery is still very much the law of the land. So, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, not to mention the other counties that had been exempt in January 1, 1863, it was still present until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Slavery was still present. So while on the one hand, yeah, I think, Angie, your point is absolutely right. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, and it needed that constitutional affirmation to remain the law of the land. It was an incomplete executive order on top of it. And so the final death of slavery, the final wiping away of slavery, is the 13th Amendment. Slavery continues to exist in the United States until the 13th Amendment is ratified. And that is a tectonic shift that must be mentioned. It was very much apparent then, but in the popular narrative of the war today, I think that nuance has been lost, but it's a significant nuance we need to remember.
I actually think that was one of the brilliances of the movie Lincoln, is it made the passage of a piece of legislation highly dramatic.
Yeah.
And it was a highly consequential piece of legislation. Another item I'll toss out there, the surrender of the Confederate Army seems like a pretty obvious kind of thing. But I think particularly Lee's decision not to turn it into guerrilla warfare is kind of a big deal. Thoughts about that? Chris, I'll start with you this time.
I actually used to teach this at Fort Knox when we would talk about end of conflicts and how the end of the conflict is the beginning of the peace. And the actions of leaders at the end of the conflict and how you take the conflict and how you manage that transition can make or break the peace and what happens in the future. And Lee's decision in this case to not sanction guerrilla warfare is an act of statesmanship. And it's something where Lee realizes, I'm no longer a general. I'm a statesman. I have to think beyond. I have to think broader, and discard my whatever personal feelings I may have on this subject. And can you imagine if just the Army of Northern Virginia had splintered, and you've got virtually every Confederate state represented in the Army of Northern Virginia in 1865, and those guys go home and start guerrilla warfare in their states? Can you imagine what would have happened? The scale of that guerrilla warfare, the scale of depredation. It would have made some of the counter guerrilla wars that you see in the 19th and 18th century and even earlier. And I would even put the Philippine American War in this. It would make those look, it would be comparable to those. It would be nasty. It would have spread the all over for all the reasons that Lee cited. So to me, it's an act of pure statesmanship, and is a very far-sighted decision, and a wise one, obviously, as well.
Right?
Yeah, I think Chris hit the nail on the head. The idea of a counter-insurgency, what the Union Army would have had to do, put down that insurgency would have made the March to the Sea, look like a child's play. Because how do you do that, right? How do you even begin to do that without just a complete annihilation of the enemy's center of gravity? But in a counterinsurgency, where is the enemy's center of gravity? It's everywhere, every little pocket. You would have seen far more bloody combat. You would have more than likely seen the political execution of former Confederate leaders. So rather than being told to just go home, they would have been hanged, which in turn leads to a whole other ball game. So yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. Had Lee gone that route, in my opinion.
Angie, anything you'd like to add?
I agree with what's been said. I'll take a couple of different angles on it too. It's definitely a statesman-like decision, but at the same time, if we look at the Army of Northern Virginia by the time of the surrender in April of 1865, Lee recognizes that it's very much depleted by desertion. And I think he probably also recognized that there was a lot of grievances between those who are on the Confederate home front and those who were in the ranks. And a lot of individuals at home wanted the war to be over. So I think from a practical standpoint, I'm not sure he felt like he could push his men to do that out of concern for them. The other thing about not going into guerrilla warfare is, this is a little bit of a different take, but if we look at the memory of the war, there's a number of folks that argue that Lee's farewell address formed one of the pillars of what became the lost cause. And I have the text, but particularly the first passage: after 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. And that narrative became embedded in the lost cause ideology later on. As we've said before, it was not a foregone conclusion that the Confederacy was going to lose. And there are a number of ways that it could have plausibly won at various points in the war. But I think those words of Robert E. Lee were pretty significant. It's absolutely important at the time that he decides to tell the men to lay down the arms, go home. You're paroled until you're exchanged. The war is basically over. But there's always at least two sides to every story. So I think that's kind of the other part of it.
And to me, that's like kind of like an overlooked huge thing, is like, you could trace the birth of the lost cause movement to that order, right? And think about how that has affected the way everybody's understood the Civil War for 160 years, and how people have used that to excuse a lot of things, and and it's colored people's perceptions of Reconstruction and civil rights, and so I mean, I don't think the impact of the lost cause can be overstated, and it comes back to that moment you just mentioned there. On a military front, Fort Fisher, Bentonville, how would you guys situate those as military actions in the grand arc of things? Actually, since we're just passing the anniversary of Fort Fisher by the time this airs, Angie, let me toss it to you since you're in Fort Fisher land.
Yes. Well, it's I think there's a couple purposes to the assault on Fort Fisher. One is with Mobile Bay being shut off in August of 1864, this is going to be the only port that's open to the Confederacy as far as blockade running goes. So there's, on one level, that fact in and of itself speaks to how effective the Union blockade had become. And so there's a recognition among Grant and also Sherman as he's moving through the Carolinas that Wilmington needs to be closed, because if Wilmington is closed, that port is closed, that further jeopardizes the ability to feed, supply Robert E. Lee's army. And it's also necessary for, on the flip side, if Sherman is going to march up through the Carolinas and ideally eventually link up with Grant, the Union Army would then need control of that port in order to supply the Union forces. So that assault is going to, well, the second assault is going to happen in January after the first one that was under the direction of General Benjamin Butler flubbed. we can put it that way. So January 13th to 15th, this is the largest amphibious assault until D-Day in American history. And I think that doesn't get the attention that it should, but it's successful. After Union forces take the fort, they're going to be able to go into push for and occupy and take Wilmington by February 22nd, February 23rd.
And again, if we don't know the war's coming to an end, then those reasons you lay out are really important reasons. Yeah.
Yes.
So, Ryan, thoughts about the military actions of 1865?
Well, especially in North Carolina, right? You mentioned Bentonville. I think it's important to note that when Joe Johnston surrenders a month later at Bennett Place, he's surrendering 90,000 guys. This is a surrender larger than Appomattox, and so the idea that Joe Johnston is pushed into that corner via the battles of Aversboro and Bentonville, yeah, I think it's a huge deal that Sherman is able to defeat Johnston, force Johnston to surrender, and give up that amount of people for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee is a big domino. Joe Johnston is a huge domino, and you're going to start to see smaller armies surrender that summer. But yeah, 90,000 guys is not a small amount to chuckle at.
Chris, any thoughts about the military actions for 1865? Excuse me.
I agree with the comments. Nobody knew the war was quite going to end. So, looking back, we know, Fort Fisher, Mobile, some of these others. I do want to comment real quick about a couple things that happened in the summer. First is, the Grand Review is underappreciated. We had never really done anything like that in U.S. history before. And you can draw a straight line from that to the ticker tape parades at the end of World War I down Broadway when people come back. And then, of course, at the end of World War II, even as late as the Gulf War, the ticker tape parade they gave for Norman Schwarzkopf. And so it's a tremendous moment as symbolically a tremendous moment when both armies parade down Pennsylvania Avenue on successive days at the end of May 1865. The other thing I want to mention is let's not forget that the deployment to Texas is a big deal, not only from a Juneteenth perspective, but getting control of the Southwest. Because let's not forget, Emperor Maximilian is over in Mexico trying to hang on to his throne. And there's some real concern that he might decide to try and because remember, the Texas Revolution is not that ancient history. And so the idea of using U.S. troops and there's a lot of volunteer troops that go to Texas under Sheridan and under Granger and are down on the border to secure and to reassert U.S. control so that nobody else moves into the vacuum of the dying Confederacy. And so that is that is completely missed, but is something that should be mentioned. And one other thing I'll mention as well is the British took one look at the fact that the United States raised 2 million men and crushed the Confederacy in 4 years and realized we'd like the Canadians to pay for their own defense. So in 1867, that's when Canada gets Dominion status. So what happens in 1865 reverberates through North America and is something that should not be missed.
Great points. So as we wrap up our discussion, now let's pretend that we do know how the war ends. 160 years later, we're looking back. What would you invite people to look at or consider, to think about, reflect on as they look back 160 years ago at the last year of the war? Chris, can I start with you?
I would go back to what we started with, or what I started with, which is the refounding of the nation. What happened in 1865? 1865 is, if I've got to pick several, the top 5 or 6 years that are milestones, major milestones in the development of the United States to this moment, 1865 is in that top 5. And it's the refounding, the new birth of freedom, to borrow Lincoln's phrase, the refounding of the United States, and what we deal with, both the opportunities taken, the opportunities missed, and the seeds planted. All of that has made this country what it is, and are legacies that we are dealing with right up to this day. So, to understand where we are and how we got to where we are and what we're dealing with, you have to start with the Civil War and its immediate aftermath. And 1865 is the crux of that period.
Ryan.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is nothing, in my opinion, nothing history is inevitable. And so you might have some people who try to dismiss the actions of early 1865 as, oh, the war was already over, all but in name. But it took those actions and those decisions and those moments. And I think we should still kind of see those in their own place. But yeah, I think the Civil War remains kind of the defining moment for this nation. What are we? What are we going to be? And so 1865 propels us into the future. So between the decisions made and what it sets up for, obviously a monumentally important year.
Angie, this is where the letter Z works to your benefit, because now you get to have last word.
And I'm going to throw in, I guess, some creativity here and say that I guess I would encourage people to think about the war itself, and also the way that we remember it as affecting the vast majority of people in the United States. And I say that because we've had a discussion that centers around people who are very visible, right? People in high positions of authority, events that come readily to people's minds when you think about 1865 or when you think about the war. But also in 1865, there's some, I think, key events that speak to kind of how the war impacted the little guy, so to speak, and also that raise the question of culpability, which is something that in many ways we're still talking about today. And 2 of those, I mean, I guess I'm somewhat biased towards prisons given the trajectory of my research, but I think 2 events that involve prisoners speak to those points. One is the Sultana disaster, which occurred in April of 1865, where basically the captain of a sidewheel steamship took a bribe and loaded 2,000 people, many of them who were imprisoned at Andersonville and Cahaba, Alabama, on the steamer to get them home, and it exploded. And it happens at this moment where it's overshadowed by many of the things that we've been talking about, but almost 1,200 people died on that ship. And the other event is the trial and execution of Andersonville's Commandant Henry Wurz, which made front page headlines and really, like I said, kind of raised the question of responsibility for suffering. I mean, specifically at Andersonville, obviously, but I think you could make an argument too that there's some broader tones about how imprisonment was carried out throughout the South. And also, I mean, people on the other side throughout the North at places like you mentioned before, Chris, being Elmira. But I really would encourage people to think about kind of the overarching narrative, and then also the undercurrent of events that might not take the spotlight so much.
Great. And I think I'll end just to kind of thinking about a moment that has aspiration or inspiration for us. And I always go back to Lincoln's second inaugural address and that wonderful phrase that he articulates, with charity for all, with malice toward none. And it's a phrase that we continue to fail to live up to and yet always strive to achieve. And to me, those words still speak to us today and gives us an opportunity to go to those better angels of our nature and rise up and be what America's vision and ideal could and should be. And very different than lots of these other reverberations and repercussions that we've talked about today, but yet a way that we can still kind of carry on the legacy of the war ourselves in a way that's a positive way. So, yeah. I've really enjoyed this. This has been just a wonderful discussion. I appreciate the three of you being with us today. So, Ryan, Angie, Chris, thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
I'm Chris Kolakowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.